Garrett, and he's Michelle's husband, of course, and going through, sharing that major trial with her. And through that experience, he mentioned to me that he had a scripture that would be valuable to us. So that'll be our mini sermonette. So why don't we have you come on up and cover that for us?
Thank you. I just hope this is encouraging, and I just want to keep it short and sweet. So please turn to Matthew chapter 8, and we will visit a story that hopefully we know pretty well. But I find this so encouraging, because talking to so many people about my wife's condition, I can say, as I've said many times, this has been a humbling but strengthening experience, and the tears have turned to purpose. And so many times when talking about a miracle, I hear that God can heal. God can heal. No, He is the healer. He is the healer. And we are healed by our faith. So let's look at Matthew 8, verse 5, and it says, "Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him pleading with him, saying, 'Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, dreadfully tormented.' And Jesus said to him, 'I will come and heal him.' The centurion answered and said, 'Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it.' And when Jesus heard it, he marveled, and he said to those who followed, 'Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel.' And who are we? Here's a Roman centurion that had such incredible faith. And what I gather from these scriptures, and that hopefully we can all be strengthened by, Christ gave a command, and the person paralyzed was healed. Has He already given the command? You have the command right here. He has so many promises if we believe. And yes, coming up to Passover, one of the healing places that we can definitely take encouragement in is by His stripes we are healed. That's all.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open with the following question, which is actually the title of this sermon. Do we have the courage of our convictions? Do we have the courage of our convictions? Sometimes that will lead us on a trail that may be very challenging at times, but we need to realize that we have a very important role to play between now and the return of Jesus Christ. Much responsibility, spiritual responsibility. To begin with, I'd like to highlight some of the great roller coasters of the United States. There's, of course, Space Mountain, which has been around for a long time, that's at Disney. There is the Steel Phantom in Pittsburgh. And the scary thing about that, if you get unnerved by riding roller coasters, is that you're way up high, and at the bottom is there's a little embankment, and then you've got the bank of the river that goes way down, further down. You're up on the side of a mountain, and then you're up high, and you look at this big drop. And if there's ever a place to shriek and scream, that's the place. And then there are Six Flags boasts several roller coasters. The Python at Busch Gardens, and I think it's the Kumba. But I remember we had a widow's outing one time, and we took the widows to Busch Gardens years ago, and that included a number of our more feeble people that needed wheelchairs and needed additional assistance in order to get onto places. those of us that had organized the activity had just completed a string of activities. Everybody's happy, and and we told them that we'll take a break and people can use the restrooms and so forth. And we didn't realize that that group, instead of coming back to where we were, they wandered over to one of the scariest new rides, the Scorpion. And they were getting on the Scorpion from a far distance. I could see it, and I thought, no. And I started running, and I was in really good running shape back then. Stop! And I'm chasing them down, and it's too late. They're getting on very slowly, feebly, getting on the roller coaster. They're on the Scorpion. It goes 70 miles an hour. It has loops in it. And 70 miles an hour, when you're on the ground, not in a car, it's a very overwhelming experience. And Mrs. Sirks, bless her heart, she was the leader of the pack, and she had no business being on such a thing. It was a miracle that she was alive even before she got on that. And I'm running by all these signs. If you have a heart problem, if you have high blood pressure, do not get on this thing. And no, stop it. And it's too late. Chug, chug, chug. They're going out the station. And I just almost get on my knees, and I'm thinking, no. And I'm praying, instant prayer here. Be instant in prayer. That's Romans 12, verse 12. So they're chugging out, and it's a 2-minute ride. It seemed like it was 2 hours watching these people going through those loops. And you know that they could get right on. It's not like the other rides where there's a long line. Nobody wanted to touch the Scorpion. That's out of everybody else's league, but not this crowd. And so they just spun around, and the 2 minutes finally came to an end, and there they slow down, and they come into the station, their faces as white as sheets. They were petrified. And it took a while to just, okay, it's all right, you're here, you're back in real time. And so we gingerly got them up out of the place. I don't know who, the people that ran that ride, they should have known that these people were obviously lost or whatever. Anyway, nobody died. And they slowly got their color back in their cheeks. And then about 3 hours later, Mrs. Sirks is saying when they're leaving the park, oh, we had a grand time. Oh, I didn't. I just so scared for them. But sometimes we have roller coaster type experiences, and in the future we're going to be doing more than we've done in the past to be able to give a message of hope as well as a message of warning to the world. And because we spurs hope into our message, there can be a very positive position to be in. But otherwise, it can be very intimidating to see the society collapsing around us, the banks having their nightmares, and other wars and rumors of wars going on. And so it's a troublesome time in many cases. And if we have the courage of our convictions, you might think, wow, to be able to fulfill that is like climbing into the Scorpion or some of the other rides. One more tale on Busch Gardens. They have the Kumba there, and again, you forget how scary some of these are. The Kumba takes you upside down at times at random, and then at other times it'll spin you, and it's going like this. And it covers half of the park. And when it was on the inaugural run, this one radio station, Popular, decided to have their two disc jockeys talk about that ride, and they're sitting in the lead car. This is the first time that they're going somewhere, and they're using the ride. And the same thing, this person's narrating it. He's on the radio, and he says, well, we're here to test out the Kumba. Oh, it's a beautiful day in Tampa Bay. Oh, it's clear. Oh, we're getting high. Click, 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 click. We're getting very high. Wow, you can see quite a distance away. And then it started. And they're supposed to talk their way through this thing like it's a piece of cake. And this guy says, yeah, it's going. We're getting higher. And, oh no. And then they go down and up. And this is on the radio, FM. And all you could hear is, whoa, 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 all the noise, and they were scared out of their minds. So this is not for the faint of heart. But God has given us that responsibility. I think of in Exodus 3 when Moses saw the burning bush. And he was concerned, and God said, I want you, Moses, to go to Egypt. Oh, really? Yeah, I want you to go to the scorpion ride, and I want you to get on, and here's what's going to happen. Some people are going to love you, some people are going to hate you, some people are going to be up in arms, they're going to be frustrated. You're going to be challenged. You're going to be challenged maybe like you never have been in the past. And the key thing is to stay the course, to hold true to the message. And the more we put sin out of our lives, the more in tune with the end time message. What is the end time message? If we go to Matthew 24 and verse 14, we'll see that. Matthew 24 and verse 14. And some of you probably have read this so many times that you can recall it quite easily. It says that, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached into all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. So that's a guarantee. God is more than fair. He's not going to hurt or allow suffering to come on anybody or any nation except that he warned first through his prophets. He's a God of love. And as we'll see later, he doesn't want that anybody to perish, but to all to come to repentance, all to come to a way of life that means something. So Matthew 24:14 is, I think, a very positive verse. And when you talk about the kingdom of God in the future, the day is coming when all of humanity will be healed of all of its diseases and ailments. It'll be a time of regeneration of the earth, that we will revitalize the soil and the water and the air. It'll be a fantastic transition. It'll be something that this society has never even dreamed of. Every man will sit under his own fig tree. He will be able to have his children, or his wife, have their children playing in the streets of Jerusalem or other cities because it'll be safe. There'll be agriculture that'll be so successful that the plowman shall overtake the reaper. Before they can harvest all the crop that's out in the fields, it's time to start planning for the next year. There will be a surplus everywhere. It'll be a world worth looking after. When we talk about knowing the future and looking at these positive prophecies, I think you can get really excited about the future. And again, I think of Gerald Waterhouse, who spoke on this and went around. A lot of people remember, he spoke for hours. That's true. And it made sense when the church was so scattered that there weren't regular ministers around. But the more he talked about it, the more excited he got. And with the radio program I do, I've done a series on the millennium, and the more you talk about it, the more excited you get. It's not like anything else where, it gets to be old hat. I can never hear enough of children playing in the streets safely. Children live very dangerous lives. There's so many people to exploit youth. It's horrible. There are a lot of horrible things that will be replaced. A lot of mankind thinks, well, we certainly can have all the good things, but we don't have to change our lifestyle whatsoever. And yet that is the problem. So when we talk about the good things, we also have to say, life is cause and effect. Here are some negatives that didn't have to happen, but that's because of what people sow over here. And that can be changed, but will people do that? That means they have to surrender to God. And most people don't want to do that. They think that happiness is in spite of God. And so when we talk about Matthew 24 and verse 14, we realize that not everybody's happy with the message. But we have to be convinced and convicted and be determined that we will give people a message of hope and warning that goes along with that. That's the way God is. And to underscore the fairness of God, let's go over to Ezekiel 18. Ezekiel chapter 18, there's so many different prophecies that speak to these things that we're looking at. Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 27. It says here, Ezekiel writing, again, Verse 27, again, when a wicked man turns away from his wickedness which he commits and does that which is lawful and right, he preserves himself alive. That's one of the hopes when we give a message, that part of that is hope that people can live a life of blessing and not a life of curses. Verse 28, because he considers and turns away from all the transgressions that he's committed, he shall surely live. But why would he ever do that? He would have to hear a message of hope and encouragement ahead of time. And hopefully through our efforts in media, we are able to connect with people. And I know that there are others elsewhere that strive for the same thing. Verse 28, because he considers and turns away from all the transgressions that he committed, he shall surely live. He shall not die. This is so different than the typical gloom and doom where people condemn those that are sinning and almost, I won't say enjoy it, but feel superior. And there's just no room for that in the life of a Christian. At this time of year, we talk about putting sin out. We talk about unleavening our lives. That we can be as flat as a pancake with no yeast in it. That we can be truly humble and truly servants to humanity by lovingly giving a message of hope that also includes warning, yes. And if people accept that and that makes them change their relationship where they now discover God, they put false idols out of their lives, as we've been challenged to do over the years, he shall not die. Yet the house of Israel says, the way of the Lord is not fair. This is New King James. I think in the King James it says it is not equal. Same thing. The way of the Lord is not fair. O house of Israel, is not my ways which are fair, and your ways that are not fair? You know, with man running the show aside from God, God has inspired Jeremiah to write at the end of chapter 10, the way of man is not in himself to know how to direct his steps. He just doesn't understand. There's a way that seemeth right to a man, but oftentimes ends up in the ways of death. And so the house of Israel, so many even in this country, will say, well, the way of the Lord is not fair. O house of Israel, is not my ways which are fair, your ways that are not. Therefore I will judge you, verse 30, O house of Israel, every one according to his ways. Now there is an ancient Israel this applied to, but there's modern day Israel, which includes more than just the tribe of Judah, but all the tribes of Israel. And that would apply even to Britain and America. Anyway, verse 30, therefore I will judge you, O house of Israel, every one according to his ways, says the Lord. Repent and turn from all your transgressions, so that iniquity will not be your ruin. Now that is a gracious God that wants the best for us. Cast away from you all the transgressions which you have committed, and get you for yourselves a new heart and a new spirit. For why would you die, O Israel? I have no pleasure in the death of one who dies. Therefore turn and live. That is a positive message, even in a world of dire circumstances. That's the God that we worship. The God that wants people to turn to him with as minimal suffering as possible. And so we realize that things can rub off on us. If we're not striving to be close to God, we could drift. We could drift. And then suddenly, after negligence in our spiritual walk, if we're negligent, then we might think, I don't know why I made these sacrifices. I don't know why I was so excited in the past. I don't know if the Bible is relevant to me right now. People can go through that. But if we take the time to renew our God's Spirit every day, then this vision is going to be strong that we carry, and we will be able to successfully do the right things. Now, Satan has a gravitational field. If the closer we get to his activities, or people that are steeped on following in his footsteps, the more that we could become influenced the same way. If we're closer to God, though, and we need to make an effort to do that, to defy the fiery darts that Satan can throw in our direction, be close to God, then we're not going to fall into his gravitational field of sin. When you read about Sodom and Gomorrah, I won't turn there, but in Genesis 13, you have the example of Lot, who had a chance to become quite wealthy, and he had so much cattle, and Abraham, his uncle, had additional cattle. There wasn't enough room for both of them. Abraham told him one day, if you will, why don't you go north and I'll go south, or you go east, I'll go west. And that way we'll get along, our people will get along, and enough room for everyone. And Abraham was magnanimous. He said, Lot, I want you to choose first. Where would you like to establish yourself? And he looked at Sodom, and he thought, oh, this has got to be it. And it was plush, verdant. The best opportunities for him were there. And Abraham was willing to stay up on the higher plains in a different location. But Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. He was not in Sodom, but he leaned toward it. And that was how he was oriented. That's probably where he would trade some of the animals for other things that were needed. And it appears that he probably was a wealthy person that became even much wealthier. So we go to Genesis 19. I touched on this at our Bible study last Wednesday, and we have one more before the break, before the holy days, and then we'll resume it a few weeks later. But chapter 19, we see now that Lot is no longer pitching his tent toward Sodom. He is in Sodom. He's been pulled in. You might say, well, why am I in Sodom? My business is here. It's easier here. Less miles to travel. I can have a reasonably priced warehouse. I can take care of everything I need here. My relatives are here. They're not out in the woods. They're not out in the plains. So he thought that was a good thing. He didn't realize that he was adrift. And that can be a dangerous thing, to be adrift spiritually. And it got to be so degenerate there that God decided to send his angels to check out the circumstances. And chapter 19, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening. Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. Was it just a matter of convenience, or was he a town father that sat within the gates? It could be that. Anyway, when Lot saw the angels, he rose to meet them and bowed himself, his face to the ground. He had proper respect here, and he was not malicious. He was not an evil person. And he said, "Here now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may arise early and go your way." And they shocked him. They said, "Oh no, we'll spend the night here in the open square." But he insisted strongly, so they turned in and went into his house. And there he made a feast and baked unleavened bread. Interesting, isn't it? Possibly occurring in the spring. So many lessons revolve around that. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. Word got out across this city of a couple 100,000 people, maybe more. And they called to Lot and they said to him, "Where are the men that came to you? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally or have sex with them." And so Lot went out through the doorway. He underestimated the circumstances. He himself was on a roller coaster of sorts when he said, look, my brethren, please don't do so wickedly." Well, it's nice that he considered that was wicked. He hadn't lost his sense of knowing at least some of God's law. "See now," he says, "I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them as you wish." What a nightmare that would be. How can he do that? Unless maybe, and this is not a justification, that he might have thought, I know the people in this town, they're only interested in people of the same gender. So I'd make this ploy and my daughters are safe. I don't know if that was in his head. It could be a huge moment of weakness. And it's selective morality. He says, you can do that, but don't do anything to these men since they have come under the shadow of my roof. Selective morality that makes no sense. And they said, stand back. And then they said, this one came to stay here, and he acts as if he's the judge now, and we'll deal worse with you than with them. That's their threat to Lot. So the city was perverted. It was in danger. God decided if there weren't enough righteous people, he was going to destroy it. So they pressed hard against the angels and Lot, and then the angels supernaturally created some kind of a resistance or explosion that blinded the men that were trying to break through. And so it was pretty obvious there are not even 10 righteous in this city. And so the angels said to Lot, as the morning dawned, they urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And you better get this last train out of town, because it's all over. Verse 16, and while Lot says, and Lot hustled his way out of the city at breakneck speed, right? No. It says he lingered. I don't have to leave. I mean, I can't. My family's here. My business is here. My future. Everything I worked so hard for, my cattle, it's all here. I don't have time to land on my feet somewhere else. And he's wrestling, but I should go. But I don't think anything's going to happen. And he lingered. And finally, the 2 men, that were angels, grabbed his hand and his wife's hand in the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out of the edge of the city. And so they said to the family, escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. And amazingly, Lot, he doesn't even realize how deeply entrenched he is in this. He says, please, no, my lords. He thinks he's got time to negotiate. You know, I don't want to go to this city. Send me to this other city. Indeed, now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased mercy. You know, but I can't escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. So he negotiates and ends up going to Zoar. And right after that, there is a huge raining of brimstone fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. But verse 26, and his wife looked back. They were warned not to. His wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Josephus even writes that in his day, you could go to the Dead Sea and you could see his pillar, the pillar of salt. There are today many different pillars, so I don't know if that's still true. But that was an eye-opener. It's easy for people, even in this society, to say, well, we got some issues. Somebody was murdered down the street, but it's not that bad. It's not that bad. And yet, we sometimes can lose our bearings. In the pastor letter, I wrote about the undertow that can occur on the Gulf of Mexico, any ocean. And if you're standing there, you imperceptibly get moved along with the current. And you can leave your belongings on the beach in one place, and if you think, well, I'll just go out here and swim a little bit, and a half hour later I'll come back to this spot. It doesn't work that way. You drift and you don't even realize it. You can be long enough, you could go long enough, you could be a mile away from where you started. And people can drift. I spent two summers in Las Vegas, and I didn't tell my friends that I came into the church with in New Hampshire because they probably would have thought I fell away. You know, Veller in Las Vegas, of all places. I was working with children one year, and the other year I worked at the Humpty Dumpty restaurant. True story, true name. Anyway, it was on the main drag. Anyway, I was there, and I noticed something that the brethren would say, and there were about 250. You know, we don't like people coming to speak, visiting from other places, and they put us down. And they say, oh man, it was weird walking into the hotel and seeing all these one-armed bandits here. And we like this town. And there was a certain pride, even among the brethren. And they told me at different times, quote, it's not this bad. It's not this bad. You know, it doesn't affect me. But it did. There were 250 people back the time I was there. I can't account for a single person, except for two, that's true. And they ended up in one of the churches of God. Everybody else is missing in action. That's what can happen. Now, in truth, I don't think that city was much different than Tampa or Jacksonville or St. Louis. They're all pretty scary in certain sections and dangerous and need God's, the return of Jesus Christ to help them. So it's not just Las Vegas, but they were a bit more open about it and proud about it. There was a certain, you know, we like it here. You know, this is home. Well, that's okay, but as long as we're close to God, because it's a challenge. And Sodom was destroyed because people didn't want to change. They couldn't believe the message. They couldn't believe that they were part of the problem. And so there was an attraction. I can imagine some of the ads in the newspapers. You know, there are good lawyers, there are good people, there are good congressmen, and they're bad in all of those different categories. But it's becoming much more bad than good. And people could stumble into a place like Sodom and see the signs on the wall. You were invited to Sodom, the biggest and busiest drinking establishment this side of the lake of fire. Party hardy with our cougars. No cover. Come as you are. See what you've been missing. And when people drift from God, they think they've been missing something. And that's not the case. But those that are steeped in it lose their sense of right and wrong. I can imagine a lawyer's ad in Sodom. Are you deprived? Do you want something that belongs to somebody else? How bad do you want it? We confiscate anything. If you have enough money, we've got the time. You know, people that are far adrift from God could read something like that and say, that's for me. That's what I like. How about if you have persons in Sodom in a hurry to rent an apartment complex? They read the ad that comes out in the paper. Don't listen to the neighbors. Plumbing there is great. Electric cords need a little work. Several balloon payments. Needs to be surveyed. No tax liens, we think. Almost move-in ready. You know, who's our first taker? You and I cannot even imagine doing this unless we're ingrained in the ways of this world. So I've taken a fair amount of time to describe how life can be so bizarre and how there is the need to come out of a spiritual Babylon and to get away from this. Now, with that in mind, in the remainder of time, I'd like to go over to Exodus 3. Read about Moses, and God wanted Moses to be the messenger. And Moses didn't want to be the messenger. He did not want to give a warning message. And one of the reasons was he was pretty sure that Pharaoh would not want to hear a warning message. So if he doesn't want to hear it, and I don't want to give it, then why do I have to do it? And that was in his head. And God was not happy to hear that at all. If we go back to Exodus 3, first of all, Moses was tending flock out in the wilderness, and an angel appeared to him in a flame of fire. This is in verse 2, I think it is. So he looked, the burning bush continued to burn, and the bush was not consumed. Verse 3, then Moses said, I'll turn and see this great and unusual sight. And as he did, God called to him. He said, here I am. Do not draw near this place, said God. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Holy because the one who became Christ, God here, was in the close in presence to Moses. And moreover, he said, I am the Lord your God, your father, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses buried or hid his face as he was afraid to look upon God. And I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them from that land to a good and large land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place in the land of the Canaanites and the other tribes around. Now, verse 9, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come up to me. I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. So I will now send you to Pharaoh, that you will bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses instantly knew from his 40-year experience in living in Egypt and rising to prominence there, social prominence. He was a military man, a general. According to Josephus, was in charge of a successful military campaign to take over the land of Sudan, what would be Sudan now. And so Moses was well aware of the mindset of the Egyptians and the royal court. He had been there. And he knew that they would not want to be told what to do. Their Pharaoh, they believed, was the king of all gods in the world, in the universe. And they would never have to change. And they would not want somebody telling them how to live. Moses knew that ahead of time, and he was right. And he thought, if I do that, it's like asking me to get on the Scorpion and go 70 miles an hour through all these different loop-de-loops, and just be terrified and white as a sheet. I know the reaction that I'm going to get. Look, let's just skip this idea. And God says, no, this is what I want you to do. Verse 11, Moses said to God, but who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And by the way, I've been out in the wilderness now for 40 years. I'm a little rusty. I've almost forgotten the language. So he said, I will certainly be with you. And then he shows the sign where Moses was able to turn his rod into a snake and then bring it back to a rod. And then put his hand into his side and pull it out. It would be leprous, and then he'd do it again, and then it would be clean. So he says, I want you to go. You tell him you're represent the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That God has sent me to you. And go gather the elders of Israel and let them know what you're going to do. And they didn't want him to do it, even as much as they suffered. They didn't want to risk losing a new confrontation with the Egyptians and then be suffering even more. Didn't want that to happen. So they were willing to compromise with what they thought was right. Hey, it's horrible that we're treated by the Egyptians the way that we are, but it could be worse. You know, we could starve to death, so we'll just uphold the status quo. And Moses said, no, I have to disrupt the status quo. So he showed the fact that he could change his rod into a snake and vice versa, and hand become leprous and then clean again. And so now he's sort of convinced his fellow citizens that he was on the right track and that he was God's representative. And then Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh the first time. I'm not sure how they got an audience with him. You just can't show up at the White House or the Kremlin and say, let me in. Let me talk to your premier or your president. It doesn't happen that way. If you try to go to the White House, you immediately come up to the fence that's all around the perimeter. And then there are people, soldiers at different places, strategic places. And then for those that are allowed to drive in, they got to go through this checkpoint. And then there are other guards. And then at the front door of the place, additional alarms. And then you get inside, and there's a group of people that are there, part of the Secret Service. You just can't walk in and say, I want to talk to Pharaoh. Unless he might have said, tell him Moses is here. If you don't know who Moses is, read your textbooks, your history books. It wasn't that long ago that I did this and that and so forth. Maybe he got an audience that way. But he came into Pharaoh in chapter 5 and verse 1. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, at the risk of their lives, at the risk of infuriating Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord God of Israel. He never heard who that was. Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said just what Moses had feared. Pharaoh leaned ahead and he says, who is this God that I should serve him? I've never heard of this person before. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. And so he was incensed, and he commanded these people get back to their labor. And then he decided that he would force them to make bricks without straw, and it was grotesquely unfair, and that made the people suffer even more. And at a time when people needed to have faith in God, they were turning against Moses. He says, look, you made things worse. Now we have to gather bricks without straw. We have to struggle. We're getting ridiculed and beaten. And Moses then was a little shaky himself, and he went back to God. He says, hey, what's going on? I thought you were going to work this out. And of course, God had different things in mind. Yes, he did work it out, and he allowed 10 plagues to land on Egypt. What people may not know is that the 10 plagues represented 10 false gods that the Egyptians worshipped. Yeah, and God, if there's something that he hates, it's idolatry. If there's something that gets under God's skin, I think more than anything else, is when people say, well, God doesn't exist. And he pleads with people. He says, yes, that people do not want to retain God in their knowledge. That's over in Romans. It's a problem that people put up resistance against God and everything that he represents. And instead, they had the audacity to chase after Baal and Molech and Ashtoreth and other gods. And as they did that, they made it difficult on the people. To have the plagues of Egypt were designed to bring people to their knees, frankly. It started with the first plague, which was blood. And of course, the Nile turning into blood was a total disaster. It was a tragedy for the nation of Egypt, because it could kill things that were living in it, all this blood. And it was in the river, it was in lakes, it was in other waterways. It was a major curse. Now the Egyptians understood the value of the Nile River, and they had a god by the name of Hapi, H-A-P-I, who was the god of the Nile. But Hapi couldn't make things very happy in the Nile River by his, because of the curse that God had given. God had worked that curse through direction of Moses and Aaron. So the blood was the very first idol to go down the drain. The next one was frogs. And the Egyptian god for a frog was Heket, Heket. And if you were to see a drawing of Heket, it was a human, it looked like, but at the top it had the head of a frog. So they believed that Heket was worth praying to. And of course, that would infuriate God. He would, no doubt, say, if I were to try to work with the Egyptians the way I'm working with the Israelites, I would challenge them, why do you put such attention on blood and frogs to save or enhance your economy? It makes no sense. The next curse was, the third one was lice. And lice came from the dirt in the earth, and the god of the earth was Geb, G-E-B. And the pieces of dirt were, fine little dust, became lice. And so this particular god, the Egyptians wondered, why are our gods turning against us? And that wasn't actually what had happened. They didn't exist. It was God had turned against them. The fourth one in the sequence was Kepri, K-E-P-R-I, god of fertility. And this occurred when the flies came. Flies were everywhere. It was an out-of-control situation. And God inspired or induced them to conclude, yes, we worship the god of fertility, but we didn't think that God would stir up lots of dust and turn it into flies and torment us. That wasn't part of the deal. The fifth one was Hathor, H-A-T-H-O-R, and that was the god of protection. And unfortunately, he was not able to protect anything because all of the cattle died in a disease overnight, and Hathor was absolutely helpless to stop it. That's because Hathor did not exist. Following him was the goddess of medicine, Isis. And Isis was looked upon when people were sick. They didn't understand that only God can heal. So Isis was utilized by the Egyptians because they had all of these boils. I've had one boil in my life, and it was unbelievably painful. And that was years ago. But the Egyptians worshipped a goddess that they thought would protect them from boils and anything else that was adverse. After Isis, and Pharaoh was not letting the Israelites go, and he was digging his heels in. Nut was the next god. It was a goddess, Nut, goddess of the sky. But Nut was in no position to stop the hail that landed on the nation of Egypt. So it was like these gods, if they were alive, they turned against the Egyptians. But we know they were not alive. But great attention was given to them. Seth was the next god, and he was the god of disorder. And this coincides with the locust plague. And then the ninth plague, I think this was tremendously thought and inspiring, made the Egyptians really think. They had 3 days of intense darkness. You couldn't see in front of your face. It was dark everywhere, but not in Goshen, not where the Israelites were. But they had 3 days of total darkness. The one god that was above almost all the others was the Ra, the sun god. And here it's like, wow, the sun god has gone. He's losing it. He's slipping. He doesn't have the power that he did. He can't prevent darkness from engulfing this country. We may die in darkness. And so now Pharaoh was really scared, and his subjects were pleading with him. You better let him get out because we're all dead men. We're going to die if you don't do something, and only you can do it. And he agreed, and then he changed his mind. And he decided, no, I can't do it. No, I'm not going to do it. And so you know what the 10th one was. The 10th plague, death of the firstborn. Right. And so then that was devastating. And Pharaoh was angry, and he was confused, and he says, okay, and he says, get out, we'll never see each other again, and that's it. So you're riding a roller coaster of negative public opinion when you're going to Pharaoh time after time after time and saying, let my people go, you guys are pagan, you're emphasizing the wrong thing, you've been told all your lives that you were gods, that you were intelligent, that you were solid religiously, and hear the message. God says you're not, and you have to vacate. And so that was a bitter pill for the Egyptians to swallow, and they didn't right away. And instead, the Israelites were watching an amazing set of miracles unfold. Now, without God's help, Moses couldn't have succeeded. Without God's help, we can't possibly preach the gospel to the world, which includes good news. That's what gospel is. We saw that Matthew 24. But if God is with us, all things are possible. In 1959, the movie Ben-Hur came out. It was a classic. Charlton Heston was Ben-Hur. And one of the most powerful parts of the movie was a climax of the chariot race that required. How many people remember that movie? Quite a few. There were 5 weeks of filming. There were 15,000 people, extras they call them, that would make up the audience. There were 18 chariots, and Charlton Heston was a committed actor who practiced for weeks learning to drive his chariot with 4 horses, going as fast as you can go. But after weeks of practice, he pulled the stunt coordinator aside and said, I can drive the chariot, but I'm not sure I can win. And the stunt coordinator smiled and says, Chuck, you just make sure you stay in the chariot, and I'll make sure you win the race. Heston didn't think he was capable of winning, but it's the movie, of course, that had it arranged where he was going to win. It's in the script. It wasn't up to him to win. All he had to do was not to fall out of the chariot during the filming, and the outcome was assured. And that's what God was saying to Moses. You just do what I tell you to do, and I'll do the rest. It's in the script. God said, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. And afterwards, he will let you go. So it was in the script. And that's a lesson to us. God says he'll be with us in the biggest challenges of our lives. If we could draw close to him, he'll draw close to us. And as an added bonus, if Satan's around, he flees. That's in James 4, verse 7. It's an encouragement when we see the hand of God at work. And the closer we are to God, the more we can see his hand. And that's extremely important. So we need to savor that. We are speaking and carrying a message to people that will accept it happily, but in many cases, they won't. They won't. And they will end up taking the consequences. Life is a matter of choices. And we know that we have the opportunity to make God pleased with us. He has so many things he wants to share with and direct us to do after Christ returns, and it's up to us. It's up to us. We have to overcome ourselves. We have to overcome the world. We don't want to be overcome by the world. We can't fall out of the chariot or fall off the scorpion ride, whatever. We realize that The people who embrace the values of this world do not want to be told that they're wrong. They become slaves to sin, but they deceive themselves. And again, how would you and I feel if a prophet came to us and said, this is what God says, you've been lacking here and over here and so forth? Most people don't want to be told that. Most people don't want to repent. Me, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I'm pretty good. That's not, that might be human nature at work, but that's not what God says of us. He looks at us and says, I love those people, I love them so much, but they got to change here and there. They have to change. So I conclude this. Let's be sure that we stay out of Satan's gravitational field. Let's be desirous of wanting God to be in our lives so that we fulfill what it says in Luke 1:37, Matthew 19, verse 26, with God all things are possible. Life is such a challenge. We don't want to face the future without God involved in our lives. We want God to give us the same courage and help He gave to Moses, that whoever we talk to, whatever governments or kings or prime ministers or whatever that we need to ultimately reach, we will have God's blessing. So let's have the courage of our convictions.